Welcome. Let yourself go heavy. Not all at once. Just a little more with each breath. A little more into the cushion beneath you. A little less inside your head. You're not trying to do anything right now. Just be still and listen. We begin the same way we always do, but something feels different tonight. The motel's hum is wrong. Not louder or quieter, just off. The hallway clocks are ticking, just a little more out of sync than usual. The ice machine outside room 8 is working, which is strange, because it hasn't worked in years. And when I passed the mirror in the lobby earlier, I could have sworn I saw myself blink. Still, you're safe here. At least, I think you are. Tonight, you've found your way into a room we don't usually rent out. Room 260. We don't advertise it. We don't clean it. But sometimes, when the desert wind comes from the northeast, the key ends up on the front desk, just sitting there, waiting. The curtains in the room don't move with the breeze. The phone rings even when it's unplugged. And the TV, well, let's just say you don't want to leave it on overnight. Guests who used to stay in 260 often left in a hurry. Some say it's the cold spots. Others say it's the feeling that they're being watched. Not by a person or by a camera. But you're here now, and whatever this room wants to show you, we'll face it together. This is the Dreamland Motel. A resting place for the deeply curious, where not every door leads somewhere you can name, and not every silence is empty. Tonight, we're unlocking a room that echoes with something stranger than sound. A patch of land in the Uinta Basin, a place where the sky, the ground, and the mind itself twist. They call it Skinwalker Ranch. If you feel like coming back sometime, we'd be glad to greet you. And if you enjoy your stay, you're welcome to like and subscribe. Leave a comment in the guest book below. Tell us where you're from and what time it is for you. Some guests never really leave. They just fade into the wallpaper. So if the lights flicker, don't worry. It might just be them saying hello. Let's begin. Long before the cameras rolled, before the concrete pads and motion sensors, before the phrase Skinwalker Ranch became a brand whispered in paranormal circles, this land already knew how to keep a secret. The Uinta Basin rests like a bowl cupped by mountains. Northeastern Utah cradled in scrubland and silence. It's the kind of place that feels even older than it is, where messers watch the horizon like sentinels, and in the stillness, stories gather. This region was home to the Ute people for centuries, long before the settlers arrived, long before airstrips and cattle fences interrupted the sagebrush. But even the Ute called parts of this land forbidden. They wouldn't hunt here, wouldn't walk here after dark, not because of any visible danger, but because of what they thought might be watching. According to Ute tradition, something terrible happened here long ago. During the 1800s, relations between the Ute and the neighbouring Navajo turned violent, especially after some Ute bands allied with Kit Carson during his Scorched Earth campaign against the Navajo people. What followed was the Long Walk, a subject worthy of its own video. Not for the Dreamland Motel. Someone more qualified. In short, it was a brutal, forced march of thousands of Navajo people into exile and starvation. And from that wound, legend says, a curse was born. Navajo medicine men, deeply wronged and seeking retribution, were said to have summoned something to haunt this land. Not spirits of the dead, not ghosts, something darker, something alive. Shapeshifters. They called them Yi Naldlushi, translated into English, crudely, as skinwalkers. To the Navajo, a skinwalker is not a creature, not a monster in the woods. It's a person, a witch, someone who chose darkness, whose committed acts so taboo, like killing a close relative, they were cast out, stripped of identity, and given power in exchange. The power to become something else. Wolves, coyotes, owls. They wear the skins of the night, quite literally. And when they move, it's wrong somehow. Too fast, too smooth, sometimes upright, sometimes human-eyed. These aren't campfire tales, they're warnings. And in Navajo tradition, you don't speak the name lightly. In fact, you're not supposed to say it at all. Not after dark. Not around strangers. Not without protection. Because when you speak of them, they might be listening. The Ute, for their part, don't have skinwalkers in their own spiritual traditions. But they believe the curse was real, that something was brought here, and that it never left. Some Ute elders speak of enormous, dog-headed figures stalking the ridge at night, of caves in the nearby canyon, Dark Canyon they call it, where the witches live, of glowing red eyes, of animal tracks too large, too deep, and too purposeful to be natural. This land is on the path of the skinwalker, a place where these beings pass through, hiding behind rock and dusk. And they avoid it to this day, not out of superstition, out of survival. It's not just the Ute who whispered of strange things here. Long before the term Skinwalker Ranch was coined, settlers in the Uinta Basin were seeing lights in the sky. As far back as the 1770s, Spanish missionaries noted fireballs in the sky while crossing the area. In the decades that followed, early Mormon pioneers and ranchers reported what they called spook lights dancing above the desert, and livestock vanishing under mysterious circumstances. One local, decades later, described hearing voices outside her homestead, mimicking her husband's call, except he wasn't home. Another saw a deer leap a fence and then run on two legs like a man. By the 1960s, the basin was flooded with UFO sightings. The skies filled with cigar-shaped crafts, glowing discs, silent triangles the size of buildings. Law enforcement took so many calls, they stopped responding. Even officers became witnesses. Locals began calling it UFO Alley. And then came the mutilations. Ranchers found cattle drained of blood, organs removed with surgical precision, eyes cored cleanly from skulls. No predators, no tracks, no explanation. Some moved toward folklore, some moved toward science, and others simply moved away. A school teacher named Junior Hicks began collecting the reports. Over 400 sightings, he said. He noted a pattern. Sightings would spike alongside cattle deaths. Lights would appear near water. Sometimes, people would fall ill. And through it all, the stories of the skinwalkers lingered, half-remembered warnings from elders, tales that made sense only after you saw something that didn't. For centuries, the Uinta Basin had been holding its breath. Its stories passed hand to hand, never fully explained, never fully gone. The property that would one day be called Skinwalker Ranch was first homesteaded in the early 1900s by a family named Myers. Kenneth and Edith Myers moved onto the land as early as 1934, though portions of it had been claimed by their family even earlier as part of the US government's land patent program. Like many settlers, they came west in search of opportunity and stayed because the land allowed it. For over 60 years, the Myers lived quietly on the property. They built the original homestead buildings, grazed a few animals, and tended to their slice of earth. Neighbours described them as private and modest, the kind of folks who minded their business and didn't much care for visitors. Strangely, despite living there for decades, the Myers left very few records. No diaries of strange events, no public tales of flying lights or missing animals. But some who knew them whispered otherwise, that they'd seen things, heard things, that they kept the windows bolted and the doors locked tight, even in daylight. Some say that when they left the property in the early 90s, they warned the next buyers not to dig on the land. A strange thing to say in ranch country, but not so strange if you know the stories. It's worth noting, however, that Garth Myers, the heir to the ranch, has denied these rumours outright. No warnings, no secrets, just land, just a home. But if that land did hold any secrets, it was the Sherman family who accidentally gave them a microphone. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman bought the property. They didn't call it Skinwalker Ranch. At the time it was just land, a 480-acre ranch tucked up against the edge of the Ute Reservation. They were experienced cattle ranchers, hard workers, not looking for trouble, just looking for quiet. They didn't get it. From the very first day, something felt off. Not dramatic, not supernatural, just off. The house had deadbolts on the inside of every door and window. Heavy chains bolted to the walls, like for guard dogs. Even the kitchen cupboards had locks. It felt less like a home and more like a place meant to keep something out, or in. Then the wolf came. On their first afternoon on the ranch, while unloading furniture, they saw it walking across the field. Huge, too big to be normal. Calm, like it belonged there, like it owned the place. It let them pet it, brushed up against them like a family dog. And then it lunged. It stuck its jaws through the corral bars and clamped down on a calf's muzzle. Terry and his father beat it with sticks. Nothing. He ran for his .357 and shot it point blank. 6 rounds. It didn't flinch. Chunks of flesh came off, but the wolf didn't bleed. It let go of the calf and trotted off, calmly into the brush. They tracked its prints for a mile before they vanished. No blood trail, no final footprint, just gone. It wouldn't be the last time something disappeared without a trace. Over the next few months, the family witnessed things that didn't make sense. Giant birds with multicoloured feathers not native to Utah. A hyena-like beast attacking one of their horses, then vanishing mid-stride into thin air. Glowing eyes in the dark. Heavy footsteps on the porch with no one there. And of course, they saw UFOs. Dozens of them. Lights that dipped below treetops and hovered like they were watching. Silent crafts with red glowing spheres. Flying boxes. Cigar-shaped ships the length of a football field. Sometimes the lights emerged from circular orange portals in the sky, like doorways had been opened. Once, Terry and his son tried waving at one. The craft responded, flashing its lights 3 times before zipping away. And so, they started keeping a journal, counting the incidents, watching the sky, trying to make sense of it. But the sky wasn't the only thing acting strange. The ground changed too. They found circular depressions in the pasture, perfectly formed. One day, a trio of flattened grass rings arranged in a triangle appeared overnight. No footprints, no signs of human entry, just the impression of something that had been there. At night, they'd hear mechanical sounds underground, whirring, grinding, as if something was shifting beneath their feet. Other times, voices, unseen, echoing above them, speaking in a language they didn't recognize. Once, the dogs growled into the darkness and bolted in terror. Terry listened as the voices laughed, unseen, floating maybe 20 feet in the air. And the cattle started dying. Not like normal deaths, not like predators. The first one was found in an open field. A hole had been cored into the centre of its left eye. Neat, precise, surgical. No blood. Just a chemical smell lingering in the air. Then another. Same hole in the eye. This time, A 6-inch round cavity was also cut into its rectum. Clean, bloodless. Then another, and another. Organs gone. Flesh removed with tools no rancher had ever seen. No struggle, no footprints, nothing. Then they stopped dying and started vanishing. One cow's hoof prints led through fresh snow and stopped mid-step. The brush above had been broken. The trees snapped at the top, like something had pulled it straight into the air. A dozen cattle lost, their best stock gone. Whatever it was choosing. And then came the bulls. 4 enormous Angus bulls, over 1,000 pounds each. One day the Shermans returned home from errands to find their corral empty. The bulls were gone. Terry panicked. He ran the property, yelling, checking every gate and fence. Then something made him look inside a small metal trailer nearby, the kind you might fit 1 bull in with some effort. All 4 were inside, crammed together in a trance-like state, pressed against the metal walls, completely silent. The trailer door was still wired shut, cobwebs across the opening, untouched. It hadn't been opened. When Terry shouted for Gwen, the bulls snapped out of it and began thrashing, kicking, screaming. They nearly destroyed the trailer. This was impossible. There was no way to fit them in there, no way to shut the door, no way they got in without being seen, unless someone or something put them there. Like a prank. Like it heard Terry talking about how valuable they were and decided to show him how vulnerable they really were. That's when the Sherman started using the word trickster. Because it wasn't just mutilations or monsters anymore. It felt personal. Groceries they just unpacked would be back in their bags. Tools vanished, only to reappear days later, somewhere impossible. One post hole digger vanished completely, only to be found up a tree. The Shermans began sleeping together in the same room at night, not out of fear of intruders, but out of fear of what wasn't human. One night, a blue orb appeared outside, smaller than the others. Bright, fluid inside, almost like it was alive. The family's 3 dogs chased it into the woods. There was a flash, and then silence. In the morning, Terry found 3 blackened spots in the grass. Greasy piles of ash. The dogs were gone. That was the last straw. In May 1996, the Shermans went public. They'd kept quiet for 18 months, told almost no one. But it was eating them alive. Gwen had lost her job at the bank. The children couldn't sleep. The cattle were being taken. The land, whatever it was winning. They spoke to a reporter from the Deseret News, told the story exactly as it happened. No embellishment, just facts. Lights, cattle, orbs, voices, disappearance. Their story spread fast. UFO investigators took notice. Journalists, paranormal researchers. One of them was Robert Bigelow, a real estate mogul and aerospace entrepreneur. Bigelow read the story, picked up the phone, and within months had bought the ranch. He paid $200,000 for it. He made the Shermans sign a non-disclosure agreement. And just like that, the ranch was sealed off, locked down, and the scientists moved in. But that's not the end of the Sherman story, because whatever happened on that ranch didn't just stay there. Sometimes Gwen would catch glimpses of things in the rearview mirror. Terry, too, reported strange lights after the move, as if the phenomenon hadn't been tied to the land, as if it had followed them. That was the feeling that lingered long after the Shermans sold the ranch. Whatever it was, the lights, the voices, the things that moved through the trees, it wasn't confined by fences. It wasn't stopped by signatures. And yet, when Robert Bigelow bought the property in 1996, he treated it like a vault that could be cracked. $200,000 for the land, a non-disclosure agreement for the Shermans, and within weeks the gates were shut. The cameras went up, and the scientists arrived. The land had become a laboratory. This was the beginning of NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science. It wasn't a university or a think tank. It wasn't answerable to shareholders. It was an independent research body funded entirely by Bigelow himself, designed for one purpose: to study things no one else would touch. Paranormal activity, UFOs, consciousness, the kinds of subjects most scientists wouldn't go near because they knew what came with them. Laughter, mockery, exile. But Bigelow didn't care. He was rich enough to ignore the rules and curious enough to try breaking them. NIDS was his answer to the world's unexplained. If it couldn't be studied by normal science, he would build his own. The team he assembled was as strange as the phenomena they chased, but by today's standards, this was the Avengers of ufology. Colm Kelleher, a cellular biologist and the de facto director of field operations. Eric Davis, a physicist with interests in warp drives and space-time metrics. Hal Puthoff, laser pioneer and former government remote viewing researcher. John Alexander, Army colonel and PSYOPs veteran, known for his interest in non-lethal weapons and altered states. And Jacques Vallée, the French-born legend of ufology, who's long suggested that UFOs weren't from outer space, but inner. They called in everyone: biochemists, pathologists, aerospace engineers. Even government-connected names like Kit Green and John Mack hovered at the edges of the conversation. And sitting quietly in the centre of it all, like a patient zero for high strangeness, was the ranch. The first thing NIDS tried to do was observe. They wired the homesteads with cameras, set up watchtowers, stationed personnel 24/7. They tracked EMF anomalies magnetic field shifts, and background radiation. They brought instruments, thermographic equipment, spectrum analyzers, Geiger counters. But the phenomenon didn't care about protocols. In fact, it seemed to mock them. The sensors would fail minutes before something appeared. The power would cut just long enough for the orbs to pass by. Videotapes would show corrupted frames, static bursts, strange distortions, always where something important should have been. They weren't just dealing with an anomaly. They were dealing with an intelligent one. Something that stayed just outside the margins of capture. Something that didn't want to be measured, but witnessed. And NIDS did witness. On April 2nd, 1996, a healthy calf was tagged and left with its mother. When the team returned less than an hour later, it was dead. Its ear was cleanly removed, its eye cored out, its internal organs missing, rib cage spread open like a surgical display. But no blood, no tracks, no signs of predators. Kelleher would later call it a biological sampling, as if something had taken only what it needed and vanished. Then there were orbs, glowing spheres of blue, white, and red that danced above the property. Sometimes they floated silently above the pasture. Other times, they appeared to chase vehicles or observers. As we've already talked about, when the Shermans had still lived there, one such orb had lured their dogs into the woods, where they were never seen again. Even the NIDS personnel weren't immune. One observer described a moment when a tunnel of yellow light opened up in the air, a literal portal, and a creature was seen crawling through it, then sprinting off into the trees. By the time they turned the camera around, it was gone. They began calling it the control system, not just a phenomenon, but the orchestrator, not just a trickster, but something that reacted to attention and used it. Just as they did with the Shermans, things became personal. One NIDS team member, a former military intelligence officer, returned home from the ranch to find strange activity in his own house. Footsteps in the hallway, disembodied voices, an entity outside the bedroom window. His wife and children witnessed it too. Eyes glowing in the dark, a feeling of being watched. This became known as the Hitchhiker effect. The idea that whatever you encounter at Skinwalker Ranch doesn't stay there. It attaches to people, to their attention, to their curiosity, and perhaps to their fear. We'll approach this with more detail later. NIDS didn't just study the ranch. They looked into black triangle sightings across the US, studied cattle mutilation clusters in other states, examined supposed evidence of telepathy, precognition, and psi phenomena. They even worked with the FAA to collect UFO incident reports, particularly from pilots and air traffic controllers, a program that ran quietly for years. For a while, at least, NIDS was the best funded, most quietly respected anomaly research body in the world, and for a time, they believed they were making progress. But, as we know in ufology, progress doesn't always mean answers. Not everyone on the NIDS science board agreed on what they were looking for, or whether they were even asking the right questions. Jacques Vallée was perhaps the most controversial voice in the room, and one of the most respected. A computer scientist, an astronomer, and, maybe more than anything, a philosopher of the unexplained. Where others saw alien craft, Vallée saw something older, stranger. Something that didn't come from the stars, but from the space between perception and belief. He didn't buy the idea that the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch were random, but neither did he believe in simple answers. To Vallée, the ranch wasn't an alien landing site. It was a control mechanism, a system that interacted with human consciousness, not by accident, but by design. He warned the others, be careful trying to put this in a lab. You might not be measuring it. It might be measuring you. He wasn't trying to spook anyone, just to remind them, if the phenomenon adapts to your expectations, then how do you know the story you're telling isn't being written for you? The ranch would go dark for weeks, then suddenly explode with activity. Then nothing again. Years passed. The team eventually shifted focus, and Bigelow grew restless. And in 2004, NIDS was officially dissolved. No scientific paper, no great discovery, just a silence, deeper than ever. Later, Kelleher and journalist George Knapp would publish Hunt for the Skinwalker, a haunting account of what they'd seen and what they hadn't. It told of a place that broke the rules, and of men who tried to measure the unmeasurable. And in the years that followed, some of those men would return, in different roles, new names, new acronyms, new funding. Because while NIDS may have ended, it planted seeds where it mattered. Seeds that would soon bloom in the heart of Washington. And from that strange soil would grow something even stranger. A government contract. An aerospace study that wasn't about aircraft at all. And a classified effort to study the effects of UAPs on the human mind. But that's the next chapter, and we'll take our time with it. For now, try not to follow anything home. Even thoughts can leave the door open. It began, as these things often do, with a conversation in the shadows of Washington. Senator Harry Reid had always been interested in the unknown. Quietly, carefully, but interested. He'd read the reports and met with Bigelow. And when he learned about what NIDS had uncovered, about the ranch, the mutilations, the orbs, the hitchhiker effect, he didn't laugh. He picked up the phone. And within months, the Defense Intelligence Agency had issued a formal solicitation. Publicly, though certainly not advertised, it was for something called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. But the description was vague. A study of advanced aerospace vehicles that are not yet known to the public. That could mean anything, or everything. Behind the language was a plan far stranger than any fighter jet. This was not just a contract to study threats in the sky. This was an effort to understand how the phenomenon affects the human being, what it does to the mind, body, and perception. And what happens when it doesn't go away? The contract was awarded to a company with only one bidder. Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BAASS, an offshoot of Bigelow's private aerospace company, staffed with scientists, intelligence professionals, and a few familiar faces. Colm Kelleher was back. Eric Davis returned. Hal Puthoff still loomed large, his work on zero-point energy and consciousness gaining new relevance. Luis Elizondo would come in later, though his role would be more tied to AATIP than this deeper effort. But in this phase, in AAWSAP, the research went full Skinwalker. Literally. Skinwalker Ranch became a government field lab. Under the BAASS contract, it was the primary research site. They upgraded the surveillance systems, brought in biometric monitors, installed experimental tech designed to measure human psychological response to proximity anomalies. The goal wasn't just to see the phenomenon, it was to feel it, track it, quantify what happened to the observer. Were there changes in brain waves, elevated cortisol, radiation spikes, cognitive distortions? People on the team were studied as they studied the ranch. They documented anxiety, fear, illness, and in some cases, even long-term trauma. Some reported entities following them home. Others began to experience waking visions, strange dreams, physical symptoms with no cause. It wasn't just happening out there anymore. The phenomenon was acting like a contagion. But what kind of contagion? That question haunted the program. Some within the Pentagon still believed this was a nuts and bolts aerospace issue. Secret craft, hypersonic drones, directed energy weapons. But those running BAASS saw something deeper. The phenomenon was not just physical. It interacted with consciousness. It responded to belief. It changed depending on who was looking, and how. They weren't studying propulsion anymore. They were studying perception. And for a while, it worked. At least, as well as anything ever works at the ranch. The team compiled thousands of pages of documentation. UAP sightings, biological effects, psychological disturbances, geospatial anomalies, and case studies from people whose lives had been altered. It culminated in a now famous, and still classified, BAASS 494-page report delivered to the government, focusing heavily on Skinwalker Ranch. This wasn't a crash retrieval program. It wasn't reverse engineering. It was best characterized as a parapsychological threat assessment, a study of what happens to the human nervous system when reality bends. But the Pentagon doesn't like things it can't explain, and by 2010, the contract expired. AAWSAP quietly ended. BAASS operations at Skinwalker ceased. And in the years that followed, the story fractured, splintered. You see, at the same time AAWSAP was technically still running, another acronym began to surface. AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Luis Elizondo would later claim he ran it, a follow-up project focused on military UAP encounters. No portals, no ghosts, just radar data and cockpit videos. The public, and many journalists conflated AATIP with AAWSAP, and to some extent the confusion persists to this day. Perhaps that's by design. But when it comes to Skinwalker, the insiders knew better. AAWSAP was the real story there, the deeper, weirder one. It was about what happens when a government tries to study something that doesn't want to be studied, and what happens to the people who try. There were skeptics, of course. Some in Congress were furious to learn millions had been spent on what they saw as paranormal nonsense. A New York Times article would later note the program's focus on psychic phenomena. Others whispered about Skinwalker Ranch being haunted and asked what business the government had funding ghost stories. But by then, it didn't matter. The door had already opened. Something had stepped through. And in the years that followed, pieces of the puzzle would scatter. To military programs, to private companies, to tech contractors and defense insiders. And to a new generation of believers and skeptics trying to make sense of it all. Next, we'll talk about what followed. What happens after the government loses interest, but the phenomenon doesn't. About the scientists who kept digging. About the shows, the spectacle, the slow dilution of the truth. And about why the ranch still matters, even now. Even if nothing ever happens again. Because maybe what the ranch shows us isn't just the weirdness out there, but the blind spots in here. The government left the ranch in 2010, but the ranch didn't leave them. Not really. Not the scientists, not the contractors, not the families. Because something lingered. Something that followed. They call it the Hitchhiker effect, a phenomenon where whatever was being studied at Skinwalker Ranch seemed to come home with you. Lights, entities, shadows that didn't belong, beings seen in hallways, presences felt in bedrooms. Even family members, spouses, children, began experiencing the same strange bleed-throughs. It was as if the phenomenon wasn't confined to the fence line. It didn't need permission to travel. It only needed your attention. Dr. James Lakatsky, the Defense Intelligence Agency liaison who oversaw the AAWSAP contract, is said to have experienced this himself. While visiting the ranch in 2009, he reportedly saw a misty, dark figure materialize inside the Sherman home. Days later, his wife back in Virginia reported the same figure inside their kitchen, standing silently, watching. Lakatsky never returned to the ranch. Other investigators and contractors experienced similar things. One team member's teenage son began seeing shadow figures standing at the foot of his bed. Another's wife reported blue orbs floating through their home. The same type seen over the ranch during the cattle mutilations. Pets would cower. Electrical systems would fail. There were reports of precognitive dreams, poltergeist-like activity, and brief sightings of wolf-like creatures inside suburban homes. Some within BAASS began to wonder, was the phenomenon following people? Or was it inside them now? This wasn't just a haunting. This was a contagion. A cognitive and possibly physiological transfer mechanism, triggered by proximity, exposure, and most strangely of all, by attention. Dr. Kit Green, a long-time intelligence consultant and neurophysiologist, began studying these cases. He noted patterns in the way some individuals developed symptoms, not just PTSD-like trauma, but central nervous system disruptions, immune issues, and even anomalous brain structure differences. He coined the term non-local trauma to describe experiences that didn't come from physical injury, but from contact with something outside. Hal Puthoff had a theory. He believed the phenomenon wasn't just intelligence, but reflexive. It responded to human consciousness. It could be influenced, even summoned, by expectation, fear, belief. This echoed the sentiments of his colleagues Jacques Vallée and John Alexander, describing the phenomenon as a kind of precognitive sentient phenomenon, an intelligence that doesn't just observe, but responds. A presence that reacts to attention like a mirror reacts to a gaze. If that sounds like magic, you're not wrong. Clearly not your run-of-the-mill black-budget aerospace program. What do you do when a thing isn't just flying, it's watching? What if it doesn't just affect airspace, but awareness? What if it's informed by your attention, like a dream that forms around your fears? So naturally, some in the program began to wonder. Was this thing a weapon? Could it be replicated, directed? Could an enemy harness it? And if so, would we even know how to fight back? Or would we just start seeing things? They catalogued symptoms, tracked patterns, treated investigators like lab rats. Because the weapon wasn't the phenomenon itself. It was what it did to you. But this is where the funding ran dry. When the conversations got too weird, when the paperwork started to look like ghost stories, when threat assessment turned into trauma management, the government pulled out. BAASS dissolved, and the data disappeared into private vaults. But the people didn't forget, and the phenomenon didn't stop. Some say it's still hitchhiking, still waiting to be noticed, still following the breadcrumbs of consciousness, like a bloodhound sniffing thought. And what do you call a thing like that? You can't shoot it, you can't track it, you can't tell where it ends and you begin. Maybe it's not even out there. Maybe it's something we make when we look too closely, when we believe too much, or when we stop pretending it's not real. Let's talk about what happens when the curtain lifts, when the TV cameras move in, when mystery becomes merchandise, and why, even now, there are still people trying to turn this story into a spectacle. But the thing about Skinwalker Ranch, it doesn't perform on command. Not for scientists, not for soldiers, and certainly not for ratings. The ranch didn't vanish when the scientists finally left. It re-emerged, televised. In 2020, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch premiered on the History Channel, backed by the same production house behind Ancient Aliens and The Curse of Oak Island. The tone was familiar, suspenseful narration, cliffhanger pacing, scientists with puzzled expressions. And at the centre, 512 acres of desert, buzzing with strange potential. But this was not a reenactment. This was the ranch. Monitored, excavated, live. Viewers tuned in by the millions. Not just ufologists, but retirees, insomniacs, cable TV wanderers, all drawn to the story of a place where physics crack and the things in the sky didn't act like things at all. For some, it was entertainment. For others, it was revelation. And for the man behind it all, Brandon Fugal, it was unfinished business. Fugal had purchased the ranch in 2016, quietly and anonymously. He was a wealthy real estate developer, not the sort of person you'd expect to buy a cursed mesa in Utah. But Fugal wasn't like most moguls. A self-confessed sci-fi nerd, he believed something was out there, and he intended to find out what it was, or wasn't. He brought in scientists, engineers, and cameras. He built a command center, installed ground-penetrating radar, magnetic sensors, spectrum analyzers, LiDAR, weather stations. He even let the TV crew in. Not, he insisted, to commercialize the mystery, but to document the search. The ranch isn't some place for ghost hunters to get their jollies, he told reporters. It's a serious scientific endeavor. And in some ways, it is. Dr. Travis Taylor, Eric Bard, Thomas Winterton, they're not actors. They're not LARPing fringe science. They're running real experiments on real ground with real consequences. They've recorded aerial anomalies, radiation spikes, electromagnetic bursts. They've watched cows die. They've seen GPS signals curve and fail. They've watched the sky misbehave. But not everyone's convinced. The show's critics point out what's missing. Falsifiable hypotheses, peer-reviewed data, reproducible results. Science, in other words, not spectacle. Still, something is happening. Something that triggers instruments, injures people, dodges reason. And whatever it is, that may be its goal. George Knapp and Colm Kelleher, the men who first told this story to the world, are still involved. They helped write Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, a book revealing that the US government's UFO program had studied the ranch. The effort was real, the money was real, and the phenomena, well, that's harder to pin down. But their message is clear. This isn't just about UFOs, and it never was. It's about the weird overlapping with the real, and about things that follow you home, about a mystery that changes shape when you look at it. And the ranch itself, it's still guarded, still closed to the public, still flickering on screens across the world. Season 6 and counting. You can buy the t-shirt. You can follow the live stream. You can even watch rockets launch into the Utah sky. But Skinwalker Ranch isn't a brand. It's a story that refuses to be written by us. For Brandon Fugal, it's the greatest science project of our time. For skeptics, it's an amusement park ride with a good press agent. And for the rest of us, it's still open, still breathing, and still watching. A myth made modern, a lab disguised as land, a mirror we haven't yet figured out how to stop looking into. Because even if the truth never arrives, the questions keep circling overhead. I've never been one to chase ghosts. I like structure, detail, evidence. I like knowing where the seams are in a story and pulling at them. But Skinwalker, it's not that kind of story. It's the face in the mirror that you swear just winked. It's the sensation that someone's behind you, but only when you're not looking. And I'll be honest with you. I feel like I know less now than when I started this journey. And I think that sentiment would be echoed by nearly everyone who's dared to go digging there. From NIDS scientists to intelligence analysts to the ranch hands themselves. It doesn't matter how much data you collect. The moment you try to draw conclusions, the phenomenon changes, like it knows. So why here? Why this place? The most common explanation traces back to the Navajo, to the bitter legacy of betrayal between tribes, to rituals and curses, and ancient pain pressed deep into the soil. And you know what? I can accept that. Because I've been to places soaked in history, real awful history. And you can still feel it, taste it even. And I don't think that's just your brain playing tricks on you. American cognitive psychologist Donald Hoffman says, "We don't see the world as it is. We see the version of reality that's useful for survival. Our perception is merely a user interface, a dashboard. And like any dashboard, most of what it's hiding is wires, code, the truth. Maybe the ranch is one of those rare places where the interface flickers and something behind it looks back. I don't know if the phenomenon is intelligent in the way we understand intelligence, but I do know this. It behaves like it's watching, like it's responding. Sometimes I wonder if it's not something else we're interacting with, but some unacknowledged part of ourselves, a projection, a feedback loop, a version of consciousness turned inward. Something we're linked to in ways we don't understand, and because we don't understand it, we can't control it. Maybe that's why it follows people home, why it shifts depending on who's looking. Not because it's stalking us, but because it's connected to us, and we dragged it through the threshold. It doesn't seem to want to be held. It wants to be seen, but not touched. Every time someone tries to pin it down, it slips sideways. It blurs. Like it's avoiding being set in stone, avoiding being understood. And I don't have a good explanation for that. Just that when I look back at everything we've covered, all the testimonies, the data, the trauma, and the belief, I still can't say I understand any of it. Only that something's there, something real and deeply unsettling. I think part of that fear is instinct, a kind of evolutionary recoil. We flinch at rot. We step back from the edge. We're wired to avoid things that threaten our survival, even when we can't explain why. The phenomenon seems to trigger that same impulse. Whatever it is, don't go near it. And yet, I do. Like a moth to a flame. Because acting in our best interest isn't always what we do, is it? Sometimes we chase the thing that haunts us, just to see if it flinches too. So what do I take away from all this? Honestly, I don't know. You'd think with decades of research and testimony and data, we'd have a clearer picture. But I'm more baffled than ever. It's a case of more context needed, even though the context has never been richer. And what's worse, even the people who claim to know the deepest truths still keep things back. People like Lou Elizondo, someone who's advocated tirelessly for disclosure, have hinted at truths so ontologically shocking they refuse to say them out loud. Even now, even after all this. And that's what really gets me. Because I've imagined every terrifying scenario I can think of. And even with all the grisly details about Skinwalker Ranch exposed, I still can't conceive of something too disturbing to disclose. So what could it be? I do think we're capable of understanding it, at least in principle. Maybe not visualizing it, not fully, but understanding how it fits into our version of reality. But that's not the question anymore, is it? The real question is, are we ready? Are we prepared for what that understanding might do to us? Because maybe the phenomenon isn't just waiting to be discovered. Maybe it's waiting for us to grow up. The lights over Skinwalker Ranch haven't stopped. The strangeness hasn't been solved, only televised. The ground is still fenced. The cameras are still rolling. And whatever watches from the ridge, it hasn't blinked. Maybe it never will. But tonight, I'll leave the curtains open, just in case. Let it watch. Thanks for joining us tonight, here at the Dreamland Motel. If you enjoyed your stay, consider leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing for more softly spoken stories about the stranger corners of reality. It helps more guests find their way here, even if they weren't entirely sure what they were looking for. And if you'd like to support the motel more directly, you can go to the dreamlandmotel.shop and pick up a souvenir for someone who never asked for one. For now, you're safe. You made it back to your room. But if it's too much tonight, no shame in asking the front desk for a room transfer. We've got plenty of space. There's a quieter suite just down the corridor. Walls a little thicker, rules a little more concrete. Or maybe you'll stay where you are. You don't believe in ghost stories anyway. Either way, rest easy. The ridge is quiet for now, and we'll leave a light on for you. Good night.